We're going to take a quick look at the report writing methodology for Sage Intelligence report writing. We're going to have a quick review of the Sage Intelligence report structure, exactly how these reports sit together, how they work together, and the components of a report. Once we've had a look at the report structure, we're going to look at report writing methodology itself. This is going to be around some of the structures for the Sage Intelligence report structure, so it's important to go through that first. We'll then look at how report writing methodology affects consolidated reports. There's some key differentiators when it comes to consolidated reports, but more specifically, we'll talk about the two types of consolidations that are available with intelligence reporting. So let's start with the Sage Intelligence report writing structure itself. We're going to start with an ODBC compliant database. You can pretty much connect to any database that you would like to connect to. From that database, the connector module steps in. The connector module is responsible for handling connections to specific databases. The first thing we need to do is ensure that we establish a connection through a specific database. Inside that connection, we then define the container. Now, there are different types of containers that we can have. We can have basic table joins, a single table, SQL joins, we can call views, and we can also call stored procedures. From there, we can define which are the pieces of information that we need to make available. It's important to remember though that when it comes to the container, there's no information stored in the container itself. Let me reiterate that. The container itself does not store any information. The container is essentially a map to the specific fields inside the database. The container says what data you get to play with and what things you have access to. The container lives inside the connection, and the connection points to a specific database. So the container is effectively the first part of or components of our report, because we need to know what information we're pulling from which tables. So the container says that you can have access to the customer table, for example, or you can have access to the history table, and from those tables you can specify fields. So once again, the container doesn't store any information. It maps to those fields in the database tables. So the first component is the container inside the connector module. The container is what's going to tell us what information we get to play with, and the report manager module is where you actually create a report. Let's have a look at the report manager. This is where you actually create a specific report. When you add a report during that report process, you are asked which container you would like to use. They can be different containers because it's not always easy to join different tables together. For example, it's not easy to join a sales table with a general ledger codes. And you can't join a customer table directly through to a stock table. There's no field that is the same across those tables, so doing those sorts of table joins is very difficult. This is where the report manager steps in. It allows you to choose containers that bring through the information that you need. Inside of that report, you can then further customize the information that is coming through. We can define filters and parameters. I can do aggregations and summation criteria around my report, but essentially the report pulls the information via the container. Once it does that, it pulls it into Microsoft Excel, and one of the powers of the product is that once it's inside Excel, you can do a lot of things with it. Things like set up pivot tables and pivot charts. Once all that is set up, with just one click, you can link that Excel file back to the report in the report manager. That's the output that will always show up whenever you run the report. So, to run through that process again, the container specifies what tables and what fields we're going to get to play with. The report manager module defines what information from the container we want to use so that we can, for example, specify specific customers, specific GL structures, specify particular stock items, dates, periods, etc. That information is pushed through to Excel, where we can reorganize it to make it much more readable. We can organize some dashboards, some charts, however we want to, in whatever method it makes it easiest for us to read that information. We can set that in Excel and link that as a template for the report. So when it comes to a specific report, there are three parts. There's the container, which says which tables, the report itself, which has field selections, filters and parameters, etc., and the Excel workbook. Those three components together form a report. When you export a report, those are the three items that get exported. It doesn't export connection information because the company that you're exporting to may have their databases stored in completely different locations to yours. So the connection information is always going to be different. The container, the reports, and the Excel template itself, those are the things that combine together in an export to be sent to the customer. The rule of thumb when it comes to exporting a report, whatever is necessary to make a report work goes with the export. That's the process. The container is required, the report itself is required, and the Excel file is required. That's the Sage Intelligence report writing structure. Now, depending on which product you're using, whether it's Sage 300, Sage Pastel, or Sage 100, each of those products has a set number of reports. Now that you know the reporting structure, you'll recognize that each of the reports that we give you as a standard report means that there's a container in the background sitting in the connector module, whether you have access to that or not. This is a fundamental point when it comes to report writing methodology. If you've got a report already existing, then that means that there's a container already existing that provides the information for you. You can use that container again for your own purposes. So this is the inherent core when it comes to report writing methodology. So moving on to report writing methodology itself, the first bit I'm going to start talking about is understanding your customer's requirements in detail. Now this is a very important point. If I was to say to you, create me a sales report, you're immediately going to think about the information that you would put into a sales report. You could put in the customer's name, the product that they bought, the date that they bought it, the quantity that they bought, and the amount. That's a basic sales report. But for one of your customers, they may be expecting a little more detail. They might expect the document number as well. They might expect the sales representative details, who sold the product, and so on. They might not even want to see the product details. They might just want to see which customer bought what and how much they bought. You need to be very clear in understanding a customer's requirements. When they say they want a report, you need to ask them exactly what piece of information they want to see so that you can get over any miscommunication that may happen here. The last thing you want to do is go to great lengths to create a report where it was either wasted effort by bringing in too much information that they didn't want or not providing the right information that they need. The first thing to do is understand the customer's requirements in detail. And a very easy way to do this is to create a sample layout or template which shows what information would be going where inside the report. A very good option is to ask the customer, do you already have one of these? If they already have one, then the job is 9/10 done. You've got a layout, you've got a template to work from, and you can see exactly what information is required to pull through and where it's expected to go. So understanding the customer's requirements and knowing what it is that they expect to see in a report is key. You can't work effectively unless you have that information. Once you've got that information and you've possibly got a sample layout, even one that comes from the customer, you can then identify whether the information the customer needs to see is available in the database itself. Now, there may be a customer that says, I'd like to see an hour and minute timestamp of each of my sales. They might be in an FMCG type industry where tracking down to the hour and the minute types of sales could be important to them. Now that's great, but if your system doesn't record hour and minute timestamping when it comes to entering the sales information, you're not going to be able to give that hour and minute breakdown that the customer wants to see. Once you understand the customer's details and you understand what is required to get there, you can then go into the database and ascertain whether this information is immediately available or whether you can extrapolate this information. Now, when I say extrapolate, I mean work this information out based on other information in the system. An example of that could be breaking down sale by weekday versus weekend. Now, no database really stores that sort of information. But if you have the date of the sale, you can use the text function inside Excel to work out what day it is and then just do a VLOOKUP against the table to see whether that day is a weekday or a weekend. So there's an example of extrapolation. While this information is not in the system, I can still take the information that I do have and work out other things. So that does mean going through each and every field that's required for this report and checking if the information is available or if I have what I need in order to work out the information. That's key. Do that step before you even start writing the report, because then you'll be able to know from the start whether the report is possible or not. It could be that the customer is working to a misconception of what's possible from the system, and they may not have the right system that provides them with the right information. So you need to identify that all the information is in the database or can be extrapolated. Once you've determined that, you need to check if you have an existing container that meets these requirements. Now, as I said, within every integration that we have, every module powered by Sage Intelligence provides a range of standard reports. According to the report structure that I have just gone through, that means that every report has a container that's providing that information. So if these containers already exist and they're already there for you to play with, why do you need to reinvent the wheel? We have containers available that provide high-powered financial reporting, high-powered sales reporting, stock reporting, and purchases reporting. If what the customer is after is available in any of those containers, why do you need to have to go through the process of creating a new container? And this is the first thing that people should understand when it comes to report writing, is that there is already a wealth of information available to you in the existing containers. You just need to go in, look at what is available, and see if you can't apply that to the current report requirements. Now, if there is a container, you can simply make a copy of the container, make any slight changes that you might need, maybe do some customization around date formats or pass-through variables, then create the report and run it out into Excel. You haven't had to go through the whole working process of starting a container from scratch, doing the table joins, choosing fields, etc. There's a container already existing that you can start using. I would suggest making a copy of these containers rather than run from that existing container, because if something happens later and we update that container, that could adversely impact your report. There's nothing stopping you making a copy of that container, doing any changes you'd like, and then have your report run off that specific container. You'll then be able to make the changes to the container, run that data into Excel, and once you're in Excel, modify the workbook to meet your customer's needs. Just a little bit of re-referencing, maybe repathing a pivot table, doing further customizations like inserting the customer's logo onto this report to personalize it, modify the workbook to the customer's needs, and from then it's just a very simple process to save the Excel template back to the report manager. All the data is then cleared out and saved against the report. So in this instance, we haven't really had to create anything new. We've already got a sample layout. That's great. We've determined that the container is available and that it gives us all the information we need. That's great. We reorganized the layout a little bit, and voila, we've created a brand new report. When you encounter a problem with report writing, it's often the absence of a container that gives us the information that we need. We've identified that I need certain information. For instance, if I use Sage Pastel as an example, serial numbers aren't part of the core reporting pack. This is because not every customer uses serial number tracking. So if a customer wants to get a report, none of the existing containers will meet those needs because none of the containers reference the serial numbers. So if we don't have a container that meets our existing needs, then we're going to have to create a new one. Now, you can take an existing one as a base. If it accesses the correct tables, that can work for you. If you're dealing with finance, sure, there's a finance container that provides most of the information. But you can also take that container or use it as a template so that you can start seeing how the joins work. Then, create a new container defining the fields that you need. So this will require a bit more work. If there isn't a container that you can use, you'll have to start from scratch. For your joins, you'll need to be familiar with the types of containers that are available. You need to know that you can call from a stored procedure in the database, that you can call from a database view, or that you can write your own SQL query. That level of technical skill and ability is up to you to source. Either you have that ability, or you need to contact someone who can help you with that. If you're looking for a report writer, visit the Sage Intelligence website and go to Support, then Report Writers. Once you've got your container, you just step straight back into the process. You can run your report out into Excel, you can create individual reports, and you can start to use union reports to consolidate unrelated data if you wish. Now again, because you might have a sample template from a company, or you've got that template that you've created with the customer in mind, you can apply that straight over the top of your container. So the only divergence in this process is going to come through the existence or absence of containers that provide you with the information that you need. Either there will be one that you can use or there isn't, which means you're going to have to start from scratch. Okay, so let's have a look at the steps again. The first was understanding your customer's requirements. Then getting a sample layout or creating a sample layout. Now we're going to create the template and write it back to the report manager. For those of you who do a fair amount of report writing at a time, you're going to have a lot of containers available to you. There may be a container that you used with a previous customer. If a new customer has similar reporting requirements, there's nothing stopping you taking that container from your first customer, making a copy, or possibly even grabbing the entire report itself, copying the report, making a slight change, and then providing it to a new customer. Microsoft doesn't rewrite its code every time it creates a new CD. No. It's got a standard core that it copies every time. This is how report writing works. If you've got a container that already exists and you've got a report output that already exists that meets the needs of these customers, sell them the report. You're selling the product. You can resell your time over and over again. The time that it took you to create this report in the first place, you now have a product that you're reselling over time. So that is the report writing methodology itself. Now, one of the things that we're trying to stress through this presentation is that the container says what tables and what information inside those tables you're going to be playing with. If those containers already exist, you can use them again. Now, if you're doing consolidations, the same data, as in you have 3 Sage 300 databases or 3 Sage Pastel databases, the table structures in each of those databases will by and large be the same for each of the companies. Now, instead of having to ask for information from each company 3 separate times, we can use what's called a pick list command, and this is covered in the advanced course, which is available on the Sage Intelligence Academy. I can have one container. Remember that the container specifies the tables and the fields that I want to select. Now, because the table structures across all 3 databases is the same, I should only need to make one request to all 3. So when it comes to consolidations, if the company is asking you to consolidate 3 of their companies and they're all on the same ERP system, then that's fine. We can make one pick list command that uses our container to go into each of the databases and pull it through the report manager into the one report. Now, because we're asking for the same information every time, there's no problem putting that information one under the other on the same sheet. The only thing you would need to be careful of is to make sure that you bring through the company name, because if you bring through just GL accounts information from 3 separate companies, but don't have any way to identify which company these GL accounts belong to, it's going to be very difficult to break up the data in Excel later. So, ensure you bring through a field like the company name that helps you to differentiate which data is coming through from which source. Once you do this, it will run through into one sheet. The same information being requested 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, however many times, and it will be placed one under the other on the one raw data sheet. With your Excel skills, you can now pull this data into a pivot table breaking down the company's information. This method of consolidation is very different to a union report. Let's talk about union reports. You would use a union report when you're dealing with disparate data. For example, the company running, say, Sage 300 is also running a CRM system like Sage CRM and is also running an Access database for some sort of production system. I want to consolidate information from those separate databases into one report. The same container won't work every time in this instance because the field names are different every time. The table names are different every time. Okay, so I'm running a Sage CRM system, a Sage 300 system, and an Access database. There's nothing even remotely similar through these database structures. So what I need to do, if I need to consolidate these, is an individual container that pulls from each of those databases. I've got database 1, database 5, and database N. This process can happen for multiple databases, as many databases as you want effectively. I need a specific container that will pull information from each of those databases. Yes, this does mean that I'm going to need 3 separate containers because the container lives inside the connection. Those 3 containers themselves will all pull the information that they need, but instead of pulling them onto one report inside the report manager, we use what's called a union report. Now, a union report will require each of those individual reports to be created in the first place. So what I'll need to do from database 1 is create a container, then create a report using that container. I then need to repeat the process for each database that I want to consolidate. Once I've got each of those reports, I can then combine them into what's called a union report, where each of the sub-reports are sent to a different sheet inside of Excel. So as you see on the slide, there's individual worksheets in this workbook. The first worksheet will receive the database 1 information, then another worksheet will receive database 5's, then there's going to be another worksheet that will receive database N, and so on. You can consolidate as many companies as you like. You can effectively have unlimited sheets in Excel. It's up to your available memory. Now I'm talking gigs here. So how many sheets do you want to have? It's important to note though that the bigger the Excel file, the slower it's going to run because there's a lot of information in it. Once I've got all that information in there, it's then up to me as a report writer to insert more sheets, to do referencing across sheet 1, sheet 5, etc. All the way through this process, I can map my information back and forth inside this Excel report. That's the inherent difference between same data consolidations and disparate data consolidations. With disparate data, I can't run that information to the same sheet because the first report will run and more information is just going to sit underneath it. The headings are going to be different, and as a result, there's no way I can do any sort of pivot table because one after the other, the information coming out of these database files is different. I need to send them to their own worksheets, and once they're in there, I can start doing mapping across to the 4th sheet, the 5th sheet, etc. With same data consolidations, these can use the one container because the same request is being made every time, and I can run all that data into one Excel worksheet.